Hello team, welcome to another ATP Geopolitics video with myself, Jonathan M.S. Pierce. This is a Ukraine war frontline update, the first one of these that I've done for 3 weeks. This is the longest time I have not mapped for, and I apologize for that. So what I'm going to do is unfortunately race through some huge changes to the front line in a number of areas. Obviously, the Russians are pushing on left, right, and center. Putting the Ukrainians under an awful lot of pressure right across the front line, and that will be represented by an awful lot of dark pins, cherry red pins and light pink pins that signify that the Russian defensive line has moved forward in their favor. If you get a dark blue pin or a light blue pin, it signifies that the Russian defensive line has been pushed back in Ukraine's favor. And of course, my map, though it synthesizes two other mappers, Andriy-Perpetua and Suryat maps, both of their maps, I would say Andriy-Perpetua is much more of an objective mapper. Suryat maps just syncs whatever the Russian MOD say and makes the changes in accordance with the Russian MOD, but there won't be any changes to the grey zone signified by my map. It merely takes into account the Russian defensive lines. Look, if you haven't already subscribed to the channel, please do so. It really helps out. We're almost at 60,000 subscribers. That's amazing. Thank you very much to all of you who have helped out there. Okay, let's get into it now. Indeed, here we have the map, and we are going to start right at the top in the Sumi direction. No, we're not really, because actually in 3 weeks, there has been no change according to each of these mappers in this whole sector, which is pretty incredible. This was an area where the Ukrainians were having particular success around, well, success in pushing the Russians back to their own border around Dnipropetrovsk, Andriivka, and Oleksivka. There was a claim right at the beginning of these 3 weeks. I mean, we're going back now to November the 10th, which is 21 days ago, isn't it now? So that is Oleksivka there. In the Sumi direction, the armed forces of Ukraine captured another street in the village of Oleksivka. So that's supposedly this. This is Oleksivka. I think this area there is what was being discussed. As you can see, it's a street that comes down. Yeah, it's this area is taken. So that will be signified by a grey zone by Suryat maps. This is Suryat maps' Russian defensive line. That's almost certainly not the case. Andriy-Perpetua has Russia's defensive line much further to the north and puts probably the entirety of this village in the grey zone. So anyway, the reality, it appears to be that Ukraine is in control of the very south, or is contesting the very south of the village there. Okay, but that's all we have for the whole Sumi area, which is interesting. It's calmed down a lot, and I'm guessing that both the Russians, we know the Russians initially pulled troops from this area down to Proskrossk because Proskrossk was desperate, and they were desperate for them in terms of they really wanted to take it by a certain date, then another date, then another date, and now it's like whatever. But they're really trying to take Proskrossk for that big PR win, and Ukraine probably initially were like, oh, the Russians have pulled out, let's use that to our advantage and take back some of this area. And I wonder whether after doing that for a wee while, they thought, right, we need to desperately pile our troops down into Proskrossk as well, because actually, we don't want that to be a big PR loss. Then we're going to come across to the north of Kharkiv region as it goes into Belgorod, and we have these two areas that have been fairly stable, although the Russians have been pushing a little more in the Vchansk area by all accounts. There are some claims from ISW today that the Russian commander or Russians in the area have said that the Ukrainians are pushing in the east of Vchansk. I don't know whether that's all the way over here or to the east of the main part of the city. Suryat maps has the Russian defensive line pushed way further to the south here. Completely different map to what Andriy-Perpetua has there. I don't know what the reality is. There was an incident where a Russian was hanging a flag, I think, in Vchansk, and they may have been taken out by the Ukrainians as they were doing so. In fact, if we do a Control F, look for flag, yeah, assessed Russian infiltrations. Geolocated published footage yesterday shows Ukrainian forces striking a Russian service member holding a Russian flag in southeastern Vchansk. In the infiltration event, that ISW assesses does not change control of the terrain or the forward edge of the battle area. FEBA. A Russian mill blogger claimed the Russian forces planted a flag and then left the area, noting that Russian forces likely did not hold positions near the flag. So that's in the southeastern area of Vchansk. In fact, if we can get a geolocation for that, that would be pretty useful. Remember, the way you use the ISW, they do source it pretty well. These are footnotes 47 and 48. I haven't done this for an awful long time. I used to do this very much with, say, Bakhmut and whatnot. So now they have so many citations. They have to add a full-on end note here, end note section, and these are all of the claims. And so here we have two claims, both Telegram claims, or three claims for the four claims for the geolocation of that. So I'm going to just find now the geolocation for that flag and put it on the map for you. So this does look quite an infiltration. You can see from this map here, at least according to this Russian source that the Russians control, this amount of land, and they've actually stuck a flag up really far into Ukrainian territory. So it looks somewhere like over here. And if that is the case, that is pretty challenging for the Ukrainians. So we're just going to do a search here for that geolocation. So that is okay. So that's why Suriyat Maps has put this under Russian control. This is a perfect example. Actually, this is really good that we've looked at this. So what I say Suriyat Maps does all the time is, whenever there is a Russian human being in a place, it says, right, Russia controls that. The ISW said this is an infiltration group. They ran in, stuck a flag, ran back out, but it doesn't actually control. It doesn't change the control map. It doesn't signify that Russians control here. However, in order to get someone into infiltrate as far away as this, remember they were previously fighting north of the river here. And this is where it was all being fought over. Well, if they're getting all the way down here, then the Russians definitely have made some advances here, and maybe Andrew Perpetua's map is being somewhat conservative here, and the Russians probably do have greater control. But it also might indicate that these areas of control are quite porous and are quite patchy. It's almost spongy rather than a line, and we've heard this previously. So there could be like Ukrainians up here. I'm just making this up. Ukrainians up here, Ukrainians down there. But a Russian infiltration group could get through and stick a flag down here, type thing. So let that be known that lines, I don't think, do justice to the front line. And when you look at Scruffy Tails' mapping, he when he goes into areas where he's doing real granular mapping, he's like, well, this tree line here, that field there, but actually this tree line's run by the other side, and this one's controlled. Is very much more patchwork scenario. But anyway, Vchansk there is looking like the Russians are making at least some gains in that area, as they are right on the north of the northeastern axis, going further north from Kupiansk here up to the Russian border. Both mappers indicate that the Russians have made, over the last 3 weeks, some fairly significant gains coming down to the south towards, somewhat towards Kupiansk, but a long way from there. Now, this is one of the more positive areas for Ukraine. So although Andrew Perpetua has, over 3 weeks, moved the Russian defensive lines a little bit further forward, more in accordance with what Suriyat Maps had previously had, the Ukrainians are pushing back, it appears, in Kupiansk. As according to Suriyat Maps, you can see the dark blue pins indicating that the Russians have been pushed back around Kindrashivka, right up here, around Sadove, down here. and there's a bit of push and shove in this Kupiansk area. But if I was to turn off the Suriyat Maps map, you can see the massive difference there between the two mappers. You know, this is what Andrew Perpetua has as Russian control up here, just these two prongs down there. And Suriyat Maps is so much more pro-Russian, so much more charitable to the Russians. It's quite an incredible difference. If we go and look at the Institute for the Study of War, we can see it in the Kupiansk direction. Here we've got Vchansk there. We're going to come down to the north around Kupiansk, see if we can make sense of what's going on up there. I don't know if we have a zoomed in map. Let's have a little look. Before we get to Kupiansk, here we can see what the ISW states as far as Vchansk is concerned. You can see that river, the Vovcha River I was talking about previously, where the fighting was all north of that river. Ukraine controlled everywhere to the south. Well, now the Russians have got to the south of the river, and they did that mainly to the west, and that they've taken an awful lot of Vovchansk here, as according to the ISW. Now, that's not... that's somewhere between, I guess, what Suriyat Maps states and what Andrew Perpetua states. And then we've got this little flag dropping exercise over there. So you can see that ISW is saying, look, it's not changing our mapping, but they did infiltrate that deep into the grey zone. Here we have the Institute for the Study of War map of Kupiansk, where you've got all sorts going on. Here we have these are Russian infiltration areas, but not really strong control. And if we look back to here, I mean, essentially you've got Kindrashivka up here, where Suriyat Maps is saying, right, they have, I mean, Suriyat Maps is vastly different. I mean, coming down from Kindrashivka past Radkivka, there you have this whole section under Russian control, but actually Andrew Perpetua just has these two prongs there. Well, that's more in line with what Institute for the Study of War has, but yeah, really only this thin. I mean, you've got the river coming down here, the Oskil River that comes through Kupiansk, and this causes the Russians a bit of a problem because they have to try and get their troops supplied down here, and it's very difficult to get across the river here. So they do it up here, but it means that they've got that long supply down into Kupiansk itself there, and then an awful lot of grey zone, as according to the ISW there. So all this yellow area is grey zone. It's fully contested. If we look at this road coming in from the east here, going back to the Institute for the Study of War, just to give you a sense of where we are, that's going to be coming across here, I think. And yeah, so the according to Suriyat Maps, south of that road, as it hits the north-south road, you have all of this area under Russian control, and that's fully under Russian control. So that's to say that, you know, all of this area down here is fully under Russian control, and we know that's not the case. But there is a lot of grey zone activity, and yeah, everyone interprets grey zone very differently. Everyone interprets, you know, information coming from the Russian MOD differently. I mean, the ISW, Andrew Perpetua, and Suriyat Maps are going to have very different interpretations of what the Russian MOD are claiming. But anyway, that is Kupiansk. It is somewhat more positive for the Ukrainians, especially over here around Stepova Novoselivka here, where the Ukrainians are pushing back at the moment. We're going to look at a couple of other sources here. So first of all, Kupiansk, AFU cleared out the left bank part of Kupiansk. So remember, left and right banks are seen in the direction of the river flow. So if you've got a river flowing from the north to the south here, the Oskil River, then the left bank is going to be on the right-hand side, which is very confusing if you're looking at a north-facing map here, so or oriented map. So this is the left bank, and that mapper is saying that this whole area to the east of Kupiansk has been cleared, just north of that road there. And as you can see, this map has the Russians not in control of any area, essentially to the east of the river. Any of this left bank of the river area is not under Russian control. So that's all of this area up here essentially is under Ukrainian control. So huge difference of opinion there. Anyway, Ukrainians have cleared that, but that's going back to the 18th. So that's almost 2 weeks ago. And then this is going back to the 26th of November. So only about 5 days ago now, that the area around Stepova Novoselivka was cleared by the Ukrainians, as it says here, powerfully advanced west of Stepova Novoselivka. So that is over in this area there. So powerful advances for the Ukrainians there is the claim. And then as we come out of there, both mappers have the Ukrainians pushing back in a place called Hlushkivka. That appears to be under Ukrainian control, and that's what the claim is here from Grayskull, saying the Ukrainians have liberated Hlushkivka and are pushing on further to the south there. So that would be in accordance with these mappers. It looks like Suryat Maps claims that the Russians are in control of this area here, but not according to Andrew Perpetua, not according to Grayskull there. So yeah, that is an area where the Ukrainians are having at least some success. And then in the Borova sector here, the Russians seem to be pushing on to try and get closer to the Oskil River there and close off this sector here. The Ukrainians were having some success sometime back in Lozova, but it's a bit of a dangerous looking pocket now, isn't it? So probably pulling back, but of course they've got their backs to the Oskil River, so that's going to be somewhat challenging for the Ukrainians. And then you can see as we come down to the Liman sector here, the Kremina Forest sector here, and the Seversk sector. Seversk is a town, is a city that is now, you know, under huge amounts of pressure. The Russians really advancing in that sector quite considerably. Playfrars said, and this is going back to the 17th of November, so a good couple of weeks ago, Liman area, the information from Deep State corresponds to reality. Russian forces infiltrating for some days were able to capture some positions, though with heavy losses caused mostly by Ukrainian FPV drones. The Ukrainians have been working a lot with their own fiber optics in the past days here, causing a lot of casualties in the Russian infantry's ranks and also focusing on destroying positions and suspected Navik positions. About Torska, somehow there are still Ukrainian positions in it. I don't know their location exactly, so I only transferred the first street in the blue zone, but they are somewhere where the grey zone is. The blue circle is a clearing in the forest, and Ukrainian FPV drones often find a lot of single Russians trying to cross it there. So that's that area. But yeah, Torska, some Ukrainian positions holding out there, but that's going back a couple of weeks. And Torska, according to Surat Maps, is well under Russian control. Andrew Perpetua has that actually still contested areas of that, but Surat Maps has the Russians advancing hugely right across this whole sector, right in the up in the Liman area, and then right down here, and then Seversk is being encroached upon hugely. So this is definitely worrying for the Ukrainians. The Russians have had a good deal of success in advancing, I think, in the Seversk direction. And as you can imagine, with 3 weeks of activity, there is going to be a lot of success for the Russians on the map. There are a lot of pins right up and down the front line. I would concentrate more on the lighter pink pins to give you definite Russian advances. It's been some interesting activity around Chaz Yar, and it's as an omission here from Surat Maps that the Russians have been pushed back there. I am going to say a little bit about that because it's something of a surprise. I wasn't expecting sort of counters in Chaz Yar, but some claims might be to do with actually controlling those areas where mappers have thought they weren't in control, the Ukrainians, that is. Anyway, yep, so Seversk, as mentioned, is under a lot of pressure. So sorry to flip back to Seversk, but I had this still to say. So main routes of Russian movement in the Seversk area, clarifying the situation in Platonivka. Direct confrontations are quite rare since the Russians already struggled to get past Verkhovka and Myanska heights because of casualties from Ukrainian drones. As you remember here, the Ukrainians have total air superiority. So they are trying to push just south of the forest here by the looks of it. So that's, sorry to flip around, but that looks like in this direction along here. But yes, it is, yeah, pretty tough over there. But yeah, anyway, on to Chaz Yar. This was AMK mapping. These days seem to be very pro-Russian, but on the 9th of November, so we're going back an awful long time, Ukrainian forces were geolocated being shelled and hit by Russian drone-dropped explosives in southern Chaz Yar. Based on my analysis of the footage, this advance took place sometime after October the 4th, therefore being well after the city was captured in July. The idea here is that actually the Ukrainians might be in control of areas of Chaz Yar that people had assumed they weren't in control of. So if you see that little sector there between these two kind of chalk areas, that is where we're talking about. So Ukrainians control more of Chaz Yar, the southern part of Chaz Yar, than was previously thought. Remember, Chaz Yar was the next step along from Bakhmut, and it was thought it would be taken by the end of last summer, and it's held on for so long. And this for good reason. The Ukrainians want to have the fight there because otherwise it's Kramatorsk next, Sloviansk, and you can see, you know, from what's going on up here in Seversk. Seversk is the key. You know, as I said ages back that you know, it's all this dominoes understanding that you get certain settlements that are the key to unlocking whole areas, and Seversk is one of those. You knock that domino down and they all fall down type thing. If the Ukrainians lose Seversk, then, you know, Sloviansk is for the taking. And this is, we're talking the fortress cities of Sloviansk, Kramatorsk. You know, it was thought that the Russians were going to be attacking these cities, this kind of semicircle of cities, after they took Bakhmut, and they're just going to come up here. But they got stuck in Chaz Yar, and so what's happened since then is they've concentrated on Toretsk and Proskrossk, and to some degree Costantinivka, but that's going to be fairly difficult too. So anyway, Chaz Yar has seen some pushback maybe from the Ukrainians. Armed forces of Ukraine still hold many positions in the southern part of Chaz Yar, says this particular mapper. And again, we're talking between those two kind of chalky areas. And then here we have the Ukrainians advance in Chaz Yar. Again, that same area, Donetsk region, talking about advances, or it may be that the advances were some time back. Chaz Yar, Ukrainian troops have recaptured the Levantovsky district in the southwestern part, where 3.5 months ago Russian troops filmed a flag and declared the city under Russian control, and that is geolocated, and again, same kind of area. So lots of people talking about that, but those are rare blue pins in a number, in whole areas of seas of red. Now, this kind of mapping situation is pretty interesting. So you have Surat maps claiming that over the last 3 weeks, the Russians have advanced to the east of Kostantinivka and are attacking, you know, the outskirts there. Dnipropetrovsk has a Russian defensive line way further back, and then has actually moved it in the other direction, saying actually, you know, there's evidence that the Russians do not control the western edges of Alexandro Shultina there. And you're like, whoa, these two things can't both be true. So a lot of difference of opinion here as to who, you know, who controls what right along the front whole of the front line, really. But yeah, particularly around there. But it's not looking good for the Ukrainians, is it? In terms of, you know, Russians piling in resources all over the shop. They want to have these gains while the negotiations are taking place, to put them in the commanding position at the negotiating table. And yeah, that's what they're doing. Now, what Ukraine has successfully done is cleared out so this is the Proskrossk direction. They've cleared out the Dobropilia area. So if we come out a little bit here, let's do a little bit, just get it to the right kind of area. Yeah. So what they have done, if we're going to be as positive for the Ukrainians as possible. They have basically cleared out this area there, and they've done a good job of that. They've also, kept in Mynohrad, but my goodness, that is looking very, very controversial because you've got grey zone basically closing the neck there. So, they need to work really hard to supply those troops. Are they doing some kind of operational withdrawal? They've been, they originally sent in their special forces to this kind of area to keep the neck open. They're trying to pressure in the Radinsky area, in that direction, whilst clearing out the top here successfully. I presume these troops can now be used elsewhere, or whether they're going to continue to, I don't know, try and equalize this whole front line, something like that. And eventually it will look something like this, as the Ukrainians eventually give up on Mynohrad. I can't imagine that they are fighting hard to keep long-term control of it. It's all about operational withdrawal from there. But I mean, it's super difficult, super difficult. And they don't want this big PR win for Russia, but at the end of the day, they don't have the forces to continue to control these huge frontline areas, and so they've got to pick their battles while trying to hurt the Russians from a distance. It's all about flamingos and FP1s and FP2s and hurting the Russian economy, and then starting to see FP2 drones, these medium range drones, be used much closer to the front lines as well, bringing them to bear in a way that the Russians use their guided glide bombs to try and help along the front line. I think that's super sensible. So Proskrossk, I mean, we know an awful lot about, well, I don't know, maybe you don't know an awful lot about Proskrossk, but we seem to be hearing all sorts from Proskrossk all the time. So that here, as you can see, I mean, it's a bit confusing because there are so many pins because it's been 3 weeks. But essentially, although Surat Mats will have the Russians fully controlling this area here that encircles the Ukrainians in Mynohrad, it is not seen to be the case that they do have that kind of control, but it is very much a grey zone kind of area. So we go back to the ISW map and see their interpretation of what's going on there. You can see that, yeah, they have grey zone, meaning that there are Russian infiltration. So this is Russian infiltration group area. This is grey zone contested, but there are Russians poking their heads up in random places, as they get infiltration groups in to stick flags up in here and there. But it's not about this area being like areas of clear control and straight lines or lines on a map. This is all mottled and pockets of control for both sides, meaning that mapping is particularly difficult here. But I think the writing's on the wall for this whole area. Ukrainians need to use their troops as effectively as possible to cause maximal attrition to the Russians as the Russians are advancing. But remember, if you start taking out, so say if I'm trying to get a good view of this whole area, if I was to take out Surat Maps' pins and then the mapping, there is a really considerable difference between the two mappers here. So be warned, it's probably not as bad as it seems from my map, but my map is taking into account a pro-Russian mapper, and I'd say the truth is probably somewhere between the two mappers. Anyway, let's get those pins back on the map as well, as I seem to have removed them. There we go. That should do it. Okay, so now we're going to go somewhat further south from Proskrossk and going to come to Novopavlivka area, where, according to Surat Maps, the Russians are largely in control of Novopavlivka itself. But according to Dnipropetrovsk, that is not the case at all. So, I mean, that seems to be a pretty controversial claim. And we have Ivanivka here, which is a town that has apparently been cleared by the Ukrainians. So if we come to here, Yeah, this is Grayskull saying the AFU cleared Ivanivka, and that is a fairly substantial settlement. So apparently the Ukrainians cleared that, and yet no sign of that according to Syriac maps. And actually, this is the one where they apparently took out 53 Russian troops and captured 19 more. So the Ukrainians having some success in clearing that out. It's also interesting to look at the state of the Russian troops. There's no uniform clothing, as in, uniform, looking the same. It looks like they're a ragtag bunch there. But yeah, potentially Ukrainians in full control of Ivanivka, having cleared out the Russians from there. And then we come down to the Halaplay sector, where the Russians are making these big gains north of Halaplay and east of Halaplay. But again, I'd be interested to know what the full truth of the matter is. They certainly have advanced. I mean, if you look at Andrew Perpetua's pink pins here, this is where the Russian line was 3 weeks ago, and this is what they've taken in 3 weeks, which is, okay, for one of the main areas of their attacks and success. That's not huge. As in, think about the lightning counter-offensives of 2023, taking massive amounts of land really quickly. That's not what's happening here, but still, comparatively speaking, for what the Russians have gained over time, this is really good going for them in 3 weeks. And Halaplay is definitely just in an awful lot of trouble at the moment. Now, the latest ISW reports was saying that actually over the last 24 hours, the Russians haven't made any advances along the front line at all. They'd actually got, they are pushing, but no confirmed advances just in the last 24 hours. Remember, this is a 3-week map, but no advances for Russians anywhere. And they do say that in the west of the Zaporizhia region, and that's got to be Kupiansk, that the Ukrainians have made some gains and elsewhere. So I suppose that's a small positive for the Russians. If we look down at the areas, so it says Russian forces continue offensive operations in Halaplay direction, but did not make confirmed advances. So this is the one area they're doing particularly well. Look, there's another Dobropilia. Who knew? So they are really pressuring Halaplay, but the Ukrainians apparently, stopping them from making advances in the last 24 hours. And then Ukrainian forces recently advanced in Western Zaporizhia Oblast. So, some gains for the Ukrainians there, which is a bit of a rarity. So assess Ukrainian advances in Stepnohirsk, unconfirmed claims elsewhere. So confirmed gains for the Ukrainians in the Stepnohirsk area of Kamyanska, next to the reservoir as it was. Now it is not the waterlogged area. So if we zoom in, it seems to think that it's water. You zoom out and it changes to, not so much water. Anyway, I will try and do more mapping over the next, as long as the war goes on. I've been really slack with my mapping because so much else is going on. But please check out the wonderful Scruffy Tales, the War Zone. His channel gives really good mapping, goes into fine granular detail, the sort that I used to do back before I was reporting on more and more stuff. In the days of Bakhmut being taken, and we were talking each individual street on a daily basis, real granular detail. I don't have time to do that anymore, but Scruffy Tales does a wonderful job of that. I guess the TLDR is that the Russians are pushing in an awful lot of places, and it is probably correlated with their pushes in the negotiations and demanding maximal objectives achieved, and they'll point back to the front lines and say, well, look, you guys, you Ukrainians are in all sorts of trouble here. Look, we are continually taking land, and they can convince people like Steve Witkoff and Donald Trump that actually, they are in the ascendancy, Ukraine are in a weak position, and therefore the negotiations should favor Russia as a representation of what's going on along the front line. So I guess that'll be what their claims are. Anyway, thanks for watching. Take care. I'll speak to you soon.